Bonjour à tous. Donc le webinaire va démarrer. On attend quelques minutes pour que tous les participants arrivent. Et d'ici 2-3 minutes, on va démarrer le webinaire qui se fera en anglais pour la majorité de la présentation. Voilà, les gens commencent à se connecter, donc on patiente encore un petit peu et on démarrera. Bien, comme a priori les gens arrivent et pour respecter les timings, on ne va pas tarder à démarrer. Donc, je vais switcher en anglais puisque ça va être la langue de ce webinaire. So, welcome everybody. I would like to thank you all the attendees for participating to this webinar, and I would like to thank Sherry that we handle main of the presentation and assist me during this webinar. So thank you, Sherry. Before to start, I will give you some details about the organization of this webinar. So first of all, this session will be recorded and everybody will get the link for reviewing this webinar later after the session. Please take care. Normally everybody is mute, but be aware to mute your mic if necessary to avoid any noise during the presentation. It will be more comfortable for everybody. And at the end, it will be an open chat and Q&A session. So you should have on your dashboard Q&A chat channel to send your question. You can send the question in French, in English, no problem. I will translate if necessary to Sherry. First of all, I am Frédéric Maraval. Some of you are knowing me already. So I am the product manager at ISIT, and our company is involved into development tool and quality tool distribution and service, and we define solution and assist our customer for all software design and test. And we are the French partner and distributor of WhiteSource. That Sherry will present you the solution and the goal of this tool during the webinar. The objective of this webinar, software are today everywhere. They are becoming more and more complex. In the same time, there are some new constraints on software regarding safety norms or security, more and more security norms and standards that people have to achieve in order to pass some certification. On the other hand, time to market is becoming more and more crucial. The cost of the development has to be decreased. So all of these points are puts a lot of stress and challenges to the development people and to the project management. And for that, new approach like agility or DevOps have to be adopted, but such approach brings new challenges like how to secure my design to go from DevOps to DevSecOps, or how could I improve my vulnerability detection or remediation in order to achieve time to market, either in embedded software, open source are used more and more. And so new challenge or new problem comes with this new usage. So the objective of this webinar is to give you some information and helps how to improve your development cycle and to improve your security in your software, especially by using the testing left practices. So now I let Sherry drive the webinar. I just switch and stop my presentation. So let you go, Sherry.
Thank you. So first of all, thanks for the intro. I'll share my screen now so that you can see the presentation. So basically, as you already mentioned, today we're going to learn on how to use these practices of shifting left and basically closing the loop from the detection of a security issue or a compliance issue all the way to remediation. Before that, let's look and explain WhiteSource a little bit. So WhiteSource today is the leading vendor in software composition analysis space, as you can see here. We have over 1,000 customers, 25% of the Fortune 100 customers, and we keep on growing at an amazing rate. I mean, one of the statistics that are most exciting for me here is that we now empower over 2 million developers, and we basically help everyone working better with open source. So, and the question is basically, I mean, how does SEA support DevSecOps in your organization? I mean, how can you take what we learned today in the webinar and implement it in your organization? So the idea is, again, to shift left and sort of to enable this DevOps, DevSecOps culture by actually helping developers, IT, but also security and legal teams to share this responsibility and be more aware of the security best practices and legal best practices. So as we go along, we have few steps in the DevOps lifecycle, right? First of all, we plan the solution, then we code, then we build, we usually test it, and then we release and we deploy and operate and sort of monitor the application. And this is sort of the eternal cycle. In this cycle, WhiteSource has a few solutions that we will speak about today. So this is just a brief overview of what we provide and the actionable information that we provide for developers. So, vulnerabilities in open source. They keep on growing. I think most of us are already aware of it. I mean, open source is one of the biggest revolutions within the last 10 years in the software world, but it's just getting more and more chaotic, right? As we start to adopt open source, we also see more and more open source security vulnerabilities, and not only more vulnerabilities, but more actual attacks and exploits, as you can see here. So in recent years, we've seen a big spike in the number of reported open source vulnerabilities as the awareness actually rises. So we see more and more vulnerabilities. The good news is that most published open source vulnerabilities are actually published with a fix. So the fix is usually if you upgrade to a later version of that open source component, you're more or less secure. So this is the best practice. We'll see how to do that. And if we look at organizations in general, we basically see few approaches to how they deal with security vulnerabilities. So the first one is manual, right? And this is sort of the, I think the most common one. So we try to manually verify every component before the developer uses it, right? So I have sort of a security team that is managing it. They are managing the open source component, and every time that a developer wants to add a new open source component, they will go to the security team or send an email, ask to approve this specific component. Of course, this is not the best approach. It creates bottlenecks, and it basically just slows down the process. And as Frederic, you mentioned at the beginning, we're now at a stage where we need faster time to market. So we cannot allow this slowing us down. You can basically do nothing and hope for the best, but of course you're less exposed. And the best approach, and this is what we're going to discuss today, is basically you can automate all or most of the processes related to the open source management, and then we let our developers actually focus on building the product rather than handling and researching security vulnerabilities. So we see that the common way of actually handling security vulnerabilities, right? In the last slide, we spoke about how we approve a new component, but now we're at a stage where, okay, there is a new security vulnerability, it's identified. So in the traditional model or old model that we usually see, we have the security teams, they analyze and they prioritize the vulnerabilities. So they are responsible for the vulnerabilities in the software, open source or non-open source. Then they will send email or open tickets to the developers, because the developers are actually the ones who have to fix the issues, right? They are the ones who have to upgrade the versions. They are the ones who have to deal with the implications if something goes wrong. And the idea is that the developers will actually fix the issue. But as we all know, developers have a lot to do, not only fix vulnerabilities, and sometimes or usually the vulnerabilities are just left behind. And for the security teams to make this a prioritization is really hard, and specifically it's really hard to close the loop, to understand what was fixed, what wasn't fixed, and sort of track all the vulnerabilities as we go along. We also have situations where the developers have tried to upgrade the version, but it was not possible because it was breaking something else within the application, or they faced another issue or another challenge, and basically they just didn't fix the vulnerabilities. It's really hard to keep track of everything. So the challenges in the current model are pretty obvious. I mean, security teams are sort of functioning as gatekeepers, right? They're slowing down the process. We don't want to slow down the process. There is no shared responsibility because all the responsibility is in the hands of the security teams. And there are a lot of bottlenecks in the flow. There is a lot of friction between the different teams. The security team, they basically want everything to be secure. They don't care about the functionality or the application or the new features. The DevOps want to automate everything. They want to make sure that we have at least the least manual work that we can. So this is another challenge because the security team actually slows them down, and the developers, they just want to develop the next feature. They don't want to handle security vulnerabilities. It's not something fun and exciting to do. So we see a lot of friction in this process. And now when we think about the solution, we try to find a solution that will basically address these challenges. And the solution that we see working very well is to integrate the DevOps and the security culture. So this is basically what we call DevSecOps. We try to integrate the security aspects and the security best practices with the existing DevOps processes. So as we saw in the initial slide with the DevOps like eternal loop, where we had simple, small tools that actually address each and every one of the steps. So we use agile methodologies. We try to deliver small and secure pieces of code, and we try to do it in frequent releases, right? Time to market is one of the most important things here. whenever possible, we automate the security processes. So we don't want any manual work unless it's really needed. And there is a person that needs to actually view and understand the vulnerabilities. And again, we believe that the best response to the bottlenecks we see is to adapt to continuous and modern delivery pipelines. So more or less the answer is in DevOps and DevSecOps. And it's not only about implementing the right tools, it's also about shifting our mindset and sort of shifting left to close that loop. And how do we shift the mindset? So first of all, we cannot have gatekeepers. We want to build guardrails, right, to save and to keep the processes, but we don't want one team or one person to just block the process. We want to avoid bottlenecks in the process. So if there is something in the process that is slowing us down, we probably need to change it and adapt to a more modern view of the process. Of course, it's all about making security everyone's responsibility. So if in the traditional model that we saw, security was the problem of the security team, if there is a vulnerability, we go and we blame the security team. Now it's basically everyone's responsibility, right? It's not only the responsibility of the security team, it's also the responsibility of the developers, but it's the responsibility of the product to prioritize it. And it's the responsibility, it's a shared responsibility between everyone. We also want to facilitate regular discussions about the application security throughout the development process, right? So just as we discussed the functional part when we write the spec for a new feature, we also want to make sure that we discuss the security aspects, both open source security, but also security in general. So we sort of understand the business benefits of doing that, right? If we shift left, if we start as early as we can to identify vulnerabilities, there is no double work. So there is a lot of cost reduction, right? If I just find the vulnerability as early as I can, right when I research or write the code, I don't have to do it twice. It also helps for speed of delivery because we deliver a lot faster. The developer doesn't have to go to the security team and then wait for them to approve something. They just go ahead, they look at the components, the vulnerabilities are already highlighted, and if there are vulnerabilities, the developer knows what to do. He knows whether if it's use another component, upgrade to an older version, or go to the security team and ask them. But the idea is that it will not be for each and every component. So the developer has the awareness, but they also have the ownership. We're talking about the concept of secure by design, right? From the very early moment of designing the component or the feature or the product, we speak about security and we highlight that. And we also facilitate an open discussion between the teams. We spoke about the friction that we see in one of the previous slides. So we want to avoid friction. We want to keep an open discussion and make sure that it's everyone's problem. So how do we start driving DevSecOps in our organization? So it's about a very few, maybe not simple, but easy steps. The first one is to know our goal, right? What is our goal in the DevSecOps process? What do we try to do? So of course, we try to save money, we try to avoid security vulnerabilities, but essentially what we need to do is we need to bake security into the existing workflows. So we need to, first of all, identify the processes. This is an example for a very, traditional or process where we have the development stage, right? The development is its own process. Then we build in a specific CI/CD tool, usually Jenkins, TeamCity, Travis CI, Circle CI, etc. Then we push the image to the container registry if we're working with containers, and then we deploy the version to production. These are 4 main processes. Of course, any organization has different processes. If you're not using containers, probably the container registry is not needed, and maybe you push the versions to Artifactory or Nexus or anything like that. Maybe the build is done manually and not automatically. So it is about identifying the different processes that you have in your specific life cycle. Then the third step is basically determine where to automate or determine where to start. So if you're already using DevOps, you're basically halfway there. If we go to the build stage, which is the stage that I usually recommend organizations to start with the build stage if they already have automated builds. So this means that once I push the version to, let's say, Jenkins, I try to build it. Usually I already have automated tests for functional issues. So QA tests or unit tests or anything like that. These will run automatically as post-build step in my CI/CD machine. We also want to incorporate the security aspect. So this is a great stage to actually add security scanning and fail builds if we have security issues, just as I would fail builds if I had functional issues. So the developers and the QA, they are already used to the fact that sometimes builds fail and they cannot continue with the process. So again, this is about identifying those processes and actually accommodating them. So another example for that would be the code stage, right? The code is usually divided to two. The first one is in the IDE, right, where I actually write the code. And this is another great example of how you can highlight the security aspect. I mean, once the developer is in the IDE, you have extensions to actually see the vulnerabilities within the IDE. So then the developer can go ahead and fix it even before he pushed it to the repository or even before he built the version. So it's a very, it's really shifting left. Another example is we have the process of code review, right? After a developer writes the code, we usually have code review with a peer, a colleague, or a team leader. So if we would highlight the vulnerabilities as part of the code review, and that reviewer, that colleague can see that there is something wrong, there are vulnerabilities, and he would highlight that, just as he would highlight things that are not written correctly or maybe a bug that he has or a wrong architecture, he would highlight the security aspect. So these are just examples of how we take existing processes, right? We don't invent new processes. We already have the build, we already have the code review, we already have the IDE. We just want to highlight security in these different processes. So we spoke about the business benefits. Now it's more about the operational outcome. I mean, what do DevOps earn from this? What do IT personnel earn from this? What do security teams earn from this? So first of all, the versions are up to date. And this is something that I discussed briefly. The fact is, and the statistics say that around 90 to 95% of the open source vulnerabilities that are published in the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database, already have a fix in a later version of that open source component, which means that if I keep my versions up to date, I basically eliminate the risk of being exploited. Keeping my versions up to date is not good just for the security. It's also good for bug fixes and just being up to date in terms of the open source versions. The next thing is that we have nearly zero rework, right? It's not like I develop everything, I push to production, and then I find the vulnerabilities and I need to redo everything again. If I go ahead and I search for vulnerabilities all the time, even before I start to code, it's nearly zero because there are new vulnerabilities being published every day. So you may still find vulnerabilities in code that is deployed to production, but you minimize that to a very, very minimal number. Of course, we have early identification of vulnerabilities in the code. This is almost a given. And we enable a culture of constant iterative improvement, right? We constantly try to improve the process as we go with it. The next step is, okay, we identified the vulnerabilities, we detected them. Now we know that we have vulnerabilities. How do we actually remediate them? How do we actually fix them? So one of the most reliable risk mitigation strategies is to keep my version always up to date. By doing this, I actually avoid being exposed to known vulnerabilities. But this is not always possible. I mean, sometimes it is, right? If I have automated tests in place and I already practice DevOps on the day-to-day routine, but sometimes some of us are still working in a more manual way, or maybe some of our products are working and have automated builds and some we still do manually. So for that, we can always have a more manual workflow that is based on a security vulnerability policy. So for example, I can define in my policy that high and medium vulnerabilities are not allowed in the code. Maybe low vulnerabilities, I can live with them, but not high and medium. This will automatically be triggered as I scan my code, even if I do it manually, right? I don't have to do it automatically. I can do it manually. And then we highlight, the vulnerability severity, the CVSS score, etc., and also the top 6. So when we focus on remediation, one of the things that we need to take into account is that when we first scan our code, we will probably have not 1 or 2 vulnerabilities, but we will have tens or hundreds of vulnerabilities if you're just starting the process. I mean, if on one of our previous slides, you were on the ones that are just sitting there and doing nothing, once you start scanning your code, you will find that you have a lot of vulnerabilities, just because average applications have a lot of vulnerabilities. And then you will reach a stage where you need to prioritize what do you handle first and what do you handle later. And this is not a very easy task. So we have some of the obvious things, right? Of course, I will probably deal with high severity or critical severity vulnerabilities before dealing with low ones. But some important aspect is the business priority, right? So maybe I have some sort of internal application that is not exposed externally. And on the other hand, I have vulnerabilities in an external application or even a database that maybe holds some very critical information. Of course, I will want to fix first the one that is external, even if it has a medium vulnerability and the internal one has a critical vulnerability. So it's not always just up to the severity. We also have the idea of vulnerability effectiveness. I will not go too deep into it, but basically it's the ability to determine whether my proprietary code actually calls a vulnerable open source method. So this is a unique technology by WhiteSource that enables you to identify and prioritize only the effective vulnerabilities. So think about the fact that an average open source component has a lot of different methods, and you as the developer only use a few of them. If you're not using a method that is vulnerable, so you're actually protected, even though the open source has that vulnerability. So this is just a brief explanation of the effectiveness, and it also really helps us to prioritize vulnerabilities effectively. We have the exploitability. So whether or not this vulnerability can be exploited in my code. Some of the vulnerabilities can be just mitigated with, a firewall or not using a root user or anything like that. So some of the vulnerabilities, even if they are there, we can sort of ignore them if we have other practices in place. So this is, again, the place of the security team to help you and understand if there is an internal mitigation, even if you don't actually upgrade to the latest version. And of course, availability of fixes. So most of the open source vulnerabilities actually have a fix, but some of them don't. So this is another important and critical thing to mention when we deal with prioritization. So we got towards the end of the presentation, and I want to speak about a few takeaways from this. So first of all, we understand that cultural change is the key to success. If we change the culture, if we change the way and the awareness of the security aspects, we can actually succeed a lot better. Automation is our main driver, right? We try to automate whenever we can. We believe that the detection is the first part, right? It has to be in place before you start prioritization and remediation, but don't forget the next steps. I mean, having a report with hundreds of vulnerabilities is, of course, it's overwhelming. And then you need to go ahead and prioritize them and actually start with remediation. Again, actionable information is critical. So if we're dealing with developers, in our tools, we want to highlight only the necessary information, right? They don't need to be security experts in order to handle the open source vulnerabilities. We just need to highlight the top 6 and maybe a brief explanation of what this open source vulnerability is. They don't need to start and be security researchers in order to handle this. They can do it themselves. And smart remediation is the key. So we always want to upgrade to the earliest non-vulnerable version of that open source component. So with that, we will move to the Q&A session. I know that we already have some questions. So yeah, let's see.
Yes, thank you, Sherry, for this very interesting presentation. So as you say, please be free to send your questions through the Q&A chat window you should have on your dashboard. Don't be shy, we will answer to you. So first, first question. You spoke about DevSecOps and developer role during your presentation. How do you see the security team role in this approach?
So this is a very important question because sometimes when security teams hear about this approach, they feel that they're sort of being left behind, right? If the awareness and the responsibility is everyone's, what is the role of the security team? And in fact, the security team has probably the biggest role here. So the role of the security team is actually to highlight and set these organizational policies, right? They're the ones who say what is the business priority, which application needs to be prioritized first, which vulnerabilities are we willing to mitigate and which maybe we don't need to solve. They are also the ones who will review the fixes that we do, and they will have access to the general dashboard where we know who fixed which vulnerability, and they will actually track the trends along the way. So what we want to see is, of course, we want to see as we start using tools like WhiteSource, probably at the beginning we have a lot of vulnerabilities, but then as we go along with the releases, along the year or along the month, we see that the vulnerabilities are slowly decreasing. The number is slowly decreasing. So this is, again, the role of the security team to actually drive this entire process.
Okay, thank you. I think that you have completely answered to the question. New one, what is the best way to remediate vulnerabilities? Are there some specific tools to do that?
Yeah, so some of the tools, first of all, we have some automated tools. So we have a tool called Renovate. This is an open source free tool that can actually help you open automated pull requests for any open source component that has a newer version. So let's say in your GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, you're using a lot of open source components. Each time that this open source component releases a new version, and you can also set whether it's a minor version, maybe you only want major versions to open a pull request, maybe you only want stable versions and not like alpha or beta version. So our tool will automatically open a pull request for that. Another tool specifically for vulnerability remediation is called WhiteSource Remediate. And this also actually integrates with GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket. So any repository that you use, and then you can actually just get an automated pull request, but only for vulnerability fixes. So this is another important tool. And it actually helps developers because it saves time. You don't have to go ahead and research what is the version that fixes my vulnerability. You just get this automated pull request. Then, of course, you can either go and review it manually. And we also have some customers that are a lot more mature that actually merge the pull request automatically, and they have the automated test in place, and everything just works completely, seamlessly and automatically. So these are just two different approaches.
Okay, thank you. Let me check. So, third one, how can I improve my vulnerability prioritization?
So this is a great question. I think that we sort of touched it, I think 2 slides back. So first of all, prioritizing based on the business impact is the most important thing, right? I want to focus on what matters to the organization and not just remediate security vulnerabilities just for the sake of remediating them. I want to make sure that I actually focus on what's important. The second point is vulnerability effectiveness, right? Whether this actual vulnerability is effective or not. Whether or not my proprietary code actually calls a vulnerable method or not. So this is another very important tool that we see that actually saves a lot of the developers' time because they can focus on what matters and not the other things. So these are 2 main tools for prioritization, I believe.
Thank you. Maybe the last one, how do you think about actually measuring ROI for DevSecOps? Have you seen organization track average release time or number of vulnerabilities, etc.?
Yes. So one of the main tools, and this is, I spoke about it a little bit when I spoke about the role of the security teams. Their role is to track and set goals for this process, right? When you just start to implement it, you need to set goals. Maybe you don't know what the goals should be at the beginning, but of course you need to measure it. You need to measure everything. So things that we usually measure and highlight in the dashboard for the security teams are things like what is the average number of vulnerabilities per application, per product. We also see some teams having contests between the teams, right? I remediated more vulnerabilities than the other team. So typically we would want to see the graph of security vulnerabilities just decreasing over time. This is the first one. The second one is from the moment that the vulnerability was detected, how much time did it take me to remediate it? And this is a question of how frequently do you release a new version? And when you release a new version, do you actually fix the vulnerability? So we have similar and more statistics that can be highlighted for the security person. And definitely it's really important to set ROI. These are just 2 examples.
Thank you. Okay. I think regarding the time, time to close this webinar. Thank you again to you, Sherry, for your presentation. Thank you for all the attendees. Regarding question we have not answered, we will answer you directly by email. And after the webinar, when we have upload the record on our web, we will send you the link. So thank you again. Have a nice day and stay safe. Et je vais terminer en français. Donc, merci à tous. N'hésitez pas à nous recontacter par email si vous avez des questions ultérieurement. On se fera un plaisir de vous recontacter et de vous répondre. So, thank you again. Have a nice day. Bye bye.
Thank you. Merci. Bye bye.